Hello and welcome to episode 6. And in this episode, we're going to look at how to shoot really effective portraits of wildlife. Now, I don't know about you, but for me, this is one of the most rewarding aspects of wildlife photography, being able to get in really close to a wild animal and take a picture that shows something of them. And sometimes you do get a feel of the personality of the animal, and this to me is the mark of a really good portrait, that it's not only about the physical look of the animal, but you get some sense of what's going on inside their head. So what we've covered so far is planning, we've looked at gear, we've looked at how to get close. And what we're going to do in this episode is just dive in and try and get some really good personality shots. And what I mean by that, I was in Kwantu, which is a private game reserve in South Africa a few years ago now. And if you don't know how those reserves work, in South Africa, the reserve owns the animals. So it's a fenced-off reserve. There's no toing and froing. And basically, the people who own the reserve pay for the animals. And not only that, they have to manage that whole small ecosystem. So for the predators, and in this particular case, when I was there were 4 lions, pride of 4 lions, 2 males, 2 females. And they need to have enough prey animals to keep them going. So that would be springbok, it would be warthogs, wildebeest, that kind of thing, buffalo. And obviously for the prey animals, they need to have sufficient feed to support their population. So it's quite a complex thing to manage. And we did go out one morning and we found the group of lions together, and there was a very distinct difference between the 2 males. So the older male, whose name was Zulu, he was the bigger animal, not by a lot, but he was bigger in terms of not only overall size, but also much bulkier, much stronger animal. And he had kind of an easy power about him. Like, he knew he was strong. He knew he was the top lion. And obviously a very dangerous animal. He's very capable of looking after himself and taking down quite large prey. But there was a sense of this sort of easy confidence about him. Whereas the second male, and I don't think he had a name, or if he did, I don't remember it, very, very different. You could tell, I could tell just shooting at him from a 4-wheel drive, which was open, so no enclosed sides, no windows, just open. The way he looked at us, you could tell straight away that if he thought he had a chance of getting you, he would. I mean, it was that simple. Much, much colder in terms of the look. I'm tempted to say psychopathic. It's probably an unfair comparison to make, but if you know what I mean, that kind of sense with the animal, he would just go. He'd have a go at you. So this is what I mean about animal portraits, and this is true for any kind of portrait. I think when if you're shooting people, the most powerful portraits give some sense of the subject and who they are. So what makes a wildlife portrait? What's the difference between a portrait and an action shot? Well, we've spoken in a previous episode about shooting animals that are moving fast, because that is definitely one aspect of wildlife photography. Things can happen really fast, and if you can capture those moments, they're really powerful images. Portraits the reverse. Generally with a portrait, the animal is either still or moving very slowly. And I've shot portraits of tigers as they've been moving slowly towards us, just kind of doing their thing, going through their territory. And that's one way of getting a portrait. And in those instances where they're moving, you have more flexibility in lighting and how you can use it. Whereas if they're still, if they're just sitting, watching, then that's a different kind of portrait altogether. The most important thing, I think, is to really get good eye contact if you can. And there's 2 things about that. So one of them is trying to have one eye at least well lit. I tend to set my focus up on the eye that's closest to me. And that's when I'll try and capture my moment. If they're moving, I'll get shots anyway, but what I'm really looking for is where there's good light on the animal's eye. excuse me, because if the animal's eye is well lit, that's when you get that real connection with them. The other thing is to try and get to eye level as much as you can, and I'll come back to that. So how do you do that? How do you achieve that? Well, a lot of that comes down to your lens. So we've spoken about gear, and I would say that telephoto is your friend here, because a good telephoto lens allows you to get a good optical zoom. So you can get in really close on the initial image. Now, it may be that you don't exactly want to do that, and the reason why you might not want to do that is if you are shooting stock photographs, and that's different kind of composition, let's say, because you need to leave room around the subject so the editors, if they're buying your image, can put text around it or choose how they want to orientate the photo in terms of cropping, that kind of thing. But putting that aside, the key thing is to, in my opinion, get in really close. And don't be afraid of getting in really tight. So it might be that your crop or what you're seeing in your viewfinder or on the back of your camera is essentially the animal's eyes, nose, mouth, and that's it. No ears, you've got in that close. And that, to me, is really intimate. And this is where having a good telephoto lens really pays. And ideally, you want one that's as fast as possible. So I've spoken about that in one of the other episodes, but essentially the bigger the aperture, physical aperture that your lens will support, and that's at full zoom as well. So remember, on a telephoto, the aperture rating will be different from minimum zoom to maximum zoom. And that means you've got a lot more choice in terms of the shutter speed you're using without having to push up your ISO, which obviously makes the image much more noisy. So I would definitely recommend having a good telephoto lens. I tend to shoot with the 100 to 400, but I'm also shooting on a camera that shoots very big images. So it's a full frame sensor. It's a Canon EOS 5DS at the moment, and that will shoot 70 meg raw images. So that gives me a very big image as far as being on the computer goes, which means I can digitally zoom, so I can crop, expand out. And then on top of that, I use software to actually expand that image even more using an intelligent zoom, which adds pixels. So normally what happens with digital zoom, if you don't know this, is all it does, it pulls the pixels apart. So there's nothing put in between the pixels. You just got a gap, which is why you can only pull, with digital zoom, you can only make an image so much bigger, and then it starts to look really horrible, really pixely, and starts to break up. It doesn't look sharp anymore. So the purpose of using, and the software package is Gigapixel AI, and that allows me to expand that image out, but it still looks sharp. And that's what you really want, because if you want to connect with an image, it needs to be a sharp image. Now, I'd also use wide angle, and portraits don't have to be tight zooms. You can do a portrait of an animal in its environment, and that's a different style of portrait. And it's something that when I teach portrait photography for people, it's something I recommend that you take the photograph of the person in their environment. And the example I normally use is, say, someone who designs boats, and you might shoot them in their design studio where they've got their computer with perhaps a drawing on it, or it might be in the workshop where the boat's being built, or it might be in the marina, excuse me, where the boats are moored up. So the idea of a wide-angle portrait is to show context. So in the case of wildlife, you might be showing the kind of environment they're in, and those can be quite different. So, for example, I've shot in different locations, shooting in places like Victoria Falls or anywhere where there's been a good rainy season. You can have really lush green areas, lots of trees, lots of undergrowth, and that creates one particular feel of the environment that animal is in. On the other hand, if you get a chance to go up to Etosha in Namibia, the national park there, the landscape there is very different because it's basically on a salt plain. So you've got a lot of white ground. It's a much harsher environment. Namibia on the whole, when you're there, is much harsher. There's a lot of desert, a lot of sand, mountains, that kind of thing. Sort of really tough scrub. If you're in perhaps where a river would run when there's water, you'll often find that's very dry, but there'll be trees on the edges. So these all provide context. And when I've been with ERA, actually, HRA in Namibia, I've got some great context portraits of elephants moving in a group, but moving through that kind of environment. So with a wide-angle portrait, you're not only capturing the animal, you won't have such an intimate shot as you will with the telephoto if you're zooming in really tight on the face, but you start to tell the story of where they live, and that in turn starts to present the viewer with the kind of challenges that these animals are facing day to day. So portraits can be different. They're not one thing necessarily, but the important thing for me is to try and convey something about either the animal itself, its personality, or about the environment that they're in. So whether you're using telephoto or wide angle, it's all good. If you don't have a wide angle lens, you can always use your smartphone. A lot of smartphone cameras these days are very good. So obviously do the usual things, make sure the lenses are clean, that kind of thing. And try. I'll come back to that before we finish the episode. Obviously, you're going to be using natural light, and so again, how you use the light. And I did an episode on using light. That is very important. As I've said, I like to get the eye nearest to me well lit, but also the light is bringing up contours, texture, that kind of thing. So, for example, in the case of an elephant, you get the really a sense of how tough the hide is, although it can actually be quite sensitive as well, but it generally looks pretty tough, lots of ridges, that kind of thing. If you're photographing a lion or a cheetah, you've got the fur, you've got the patterns in the fur. If it's a young cheetah, you have that kind of downy fur that the very young ones have, and then that gradually disappears as they get a little bit older. So what you're bringing out and what the light you're using can bring out details in the animal. Or conversely, if you are shooting at sunset, for example, or sunrise using the golden hour, and you have the sun behind the animal, then you're looking more at silhouettes. You might be bringing out the outline of the animal and the fur. So I've described in a previous episode shooting a kudu, which is a big antelope, at just before sunset in the golden hour there, and it really brought out the fur at the top of the, around the edges of the silhouette. You may also want to shoot the animal with light on the face, but have a very dark background. And of course, that depends where it is. But if, for example, it's a lion and they like to sit in bushes, just to stay a little bit cool, but it also hides them. And if they're not moving, they're actually quite difficult to see sometimes, because often they'll look like termite mounds with the colour. So using depth of field, you can push the background hard out of focus, just have a very narrow depth of field centred around the animal's eye. And then you can push the background out of focus, which really draws the viewer's eye to the eye of the animal. And then in post, you can also work with the contrast, how dark you have that background, and you may choose to have it completely black, which then is quite a striking image. So a great place to research is Instagram, wildlife photographers' websites. Look at their work, get inspiration from people who are doing this. In terms of composition, definitely think about rule of thirds. It's I don't know. It's the one that's easy to start with, because a lot of cameras already have it marked up. Your smartphone likely has a rule of thirds grid on there. But don't devalue it, because it's a common one. It's actually quite a powerful composition technique. Keep the background simple where you can, so that the focus goes onto the animal itself and onto the eye, the face. And as I say, get to eye level where you can. So what I do when I'm in a vehicle, And I'm thinking of these Safari four-wheel drives that have windows, and they have you may have seen them have the roof that lifts up, so you can lift that up and then stand in the top of the vehicle and take photographs. When I'm in that kind of vehicle, other people I'm with generally will stand up and start shooting from the top. I'm crouching down between the the seats, and opening the window so that I can stick the lens out. And there are pictures I've taken. I think it was the thumbnail for episode 2, but it looks like I'm on the ground with the animal. In fact, I'm not. I'm in a four-wheel drive, but I've got down as low as I can. If the engine is running, I've spoken about this, but put a pad or something if you're resting the camera lens on the side of the vehicle. You just want something to absorb any vibration. I tend to shoot quite fast anyway, so the vibration is not likely to have much impact on my image, but I want to minimize that, bring that as low as I possibly can. So think about your position, where you are. By all means, experiment with other angles where you can, but if you're in a vehicle, you might be more limited. So that's my tip. Okay, so in terms of capturing emotion and personality, I've spoken about that quite a lot, but eye contact is the key. One thing that can help you if it's a more dynamic situation is just learning to anticipate an animal's behavior. So the kind of situation I'm thinking of is, again, this was in South Africa. A lion, one of the lions that I've spoken about, this was Zulu, had made a kill of, I think it was wildebeest, and it was guarding it, but it got really cranky. You could see it was not happy that we were relatively close to the kill. We didn't get too close, but even so, it wasn't happy that we were there because it had its kill. And it started displaying some more aggressive behaviors towards us. So again, from a photographer's standpoint, that's great when it happens naturally. And I was able to get some pictures of that. Also, quite often animals will yawn. You'll get those kind of things going on, which can also make great portraits. If an animal is yawning, for someone who doesn't know, it will look very much like it's roaring in the case of a lion. So just look at what's going on, and the more you can learn about body language of the particular animal or animals that you're interested in, the better, because you can start to see it happening, and then you know you're ready to shoot, but also just be prepared to shoot anyway. So there might be, as I said, particular postures. Animals will generally adopt a specific posture if they're about to strike or if they're fairly threatened, or you can have them playing. I've got pictures of lions playing together. I've got zebras, actually. I don't know what they were doing. They were kind of nuzzling one another, running a little bit, nuzzling. So I assumed it was kind of a more intimate behavior between these animals, but equally zebras can be very aggressive. So this is why you don't find domesticated zebras, because they don't domesticate. Zebras can actually be quite aggressive. They will kill the young of, so a male will kill the young of another female if he wants to mate with her. So that's behavior that's, I think, better known in things like lions, but other mammals do it as well. So these are the kind of things that can also be portraits, that you're documenting behavior. And if you are prepared, or at least observant and ready to shoot, then there's a very good chance you can capture these more unusual behaviors. So another thing in terms of postures, a giraffe drinking will, if it's with others, you might, let's say a group of 3, which is what I had in Namibia. One will stay aware, keep a lookout for predators, and the other 2, so there were 3 in this group in total, the other 2 spread their forelegs wide, and that allowed them to get their head down low so they could drink water. And it's actually quite nice getting that as a shot. Another shot I got in Namibia, just thinking about it, in Etosha, was where elephants are throwing dust over themselves, and that's a really cool picture to get. So this is where I had a group of elephants, and they were just getting just breathing in dust and then blowing it through their trunk over their bodies and waving it about as they did it. So things like that are great shots to get because they're more unusual. They're not the sort of static I'm not going to say boring shots, but the kind of shots that you see every day. It's nice to get something that's a bit different, but you need to be aware of the kind of behaviors that may happen while you're there, and then just be ready to shoot them. And again, having the right gear allows you to really start choosing and getting in tight if you need to. So, for example, with the elephants, one of them was a fair distance from me, so I had the full 400 zoom on it, but was able to get that. So it comes down to reading what's going on, but also being patient, perhaps recognizing that a certain behavior may be about to happen, and just be ready for it when it happens. So coming back to ethics, now I've sort of touched on those a little bit, but I'll just come back to them because it's appropriate here. So again, you want to approach your subject without disturbing them, particularly if you're on foot, but if you're in vehicles. I've spoken before about some of the things I've seen with certain operators where they will run a vehicle at an animal to try and provoke a reaction, which is absolutely not, that's not what a reputable operator will do, because it stresses the animal. You're not getting, well, you're getting a natural response in terms of you've now been very aggressive towards it. But that's not what, in my opinion, wildlife photography is about. So don't disturb the animal, respect distance. You may have definitely use natural cover. So in the cases where I've tracked animals on foot, I've been and found them, then I'm definitely using as much natural cover as possible, making sure I'm downwind of them, making sure I'm being as quiet as possible. If there's a blind available, somewhere you can hide, or a hide, that's also very useful. So if you're passionate about wildlife, you will be ethical towards wildlife anyway, I think, but it's worth mentioning it. In terms of getting portraits particularly, sometimes you do just have to be quiet for a while and just sit and bide your time, and then something will happen. I want to talk briefly as well about storytelling, because I'm a big one for visual storytelling. I think that's a really powerful opportunity that we have as photographers, particularly when it comes to things like wildlife that are threatened. And part of, for me, what the photography is about is getting people interested in the animals so that they will join the groups who are trying to preserve these animals. Because as I've said before, many of these animals are under threat, and there's a very good chance that future generations, even people who are alive today, will not have the opportunity to see these animals in the wild. So a good thing is to shoot showing the environment, showing, as I've said before, some of the threats that animals have to face, because that's part of their story. You can shoot and still create quite intimate photographs, so there's still that connection with the animal. And this comes down to what opportunities present themselves. Be very conscious of your framing and perspective to show habitat and character in the animal, and I've covered that. And then you can also build a sequence of images, and this I'll cover in the last episode a bit more. But a series of photographs can tell a much bigger story. You can show context, you can show behavior, you can have really tight portraits of an animal, so you get that real feeling of intimacy. And one of my favorite photographs is a picture I took of an elephant just browsing on a bush. But where I was sat in a vehicle, the bush was between myself and the elephant, but I realized as it was moving, as it was browsing, I would have a few seconds where half of its face would be covered by this bush in the foreground, and then the other half would be revealed. And to me, it was more of a reveal. It was a bit more intimate from that perspective. So again, it was just getting the ideas and then watching that particular situation develop and realizing that I had an opportunity to just grab it. So do learn what you can, be very aware of what's going on. Okay, challenges and how you get around them. So some animals are really shy, really elusive. Certainly some of the small antelope, bushbok, things like that. If you see them, they're likely to freeze for a moment and then run. So really, the only thing you can do is kind of hope you're lucky and be ready to go. So just be ready to shoot. at any time. And I don't just mean have the camera ready to go, but also just make sure that you are in the ballpark when it comes to exposure, autofocus distances, that kind of thing. Particularly with smaller animals like that, they're likely to be in bush, so you're going to have things between you and the animal that autofocus may lock onto the wrong thing. So really the only thing to do is to practice as much as possible so that you're just ready to go when those situations occur. You may as well have to deal with harsh or unpredictable lighting. So definitely time of day is not a good time to be shooting animals. I've spoken about lighting quite a lot in another episode. So keep that in mind. Just be conscious of the backgrounds as well. One of the things about doing the visual storyteller thing is that you're very conscious of background, and where you can, often with wildlife, you have to be very quick. But if you don't, if you've got time to compose a shot, just really have a good look at the background. It may be that you can fix things in post, but I prefer not to do that. I prefer to get my image as natural as possible, so as true to what I saw as possible. And make sure you keep images nice and sharp, particularly when you're at long focal lengths. And the kind of problems you got there is you might have some slight movement in the lens or in the camera and lens as you shoot, those kind of things. So support the lens where you can. I tend to use faster shutter speeds, but that's not always possible if the lighting isn't great. So just have a think about what's going on, what the problems are that you're having to deal with in the moment, and make sure you have a solution for them. So in terms of how can you be a bit more creative, do have a look at camera angles. So I've already spoken about getting down low. That's probably my biggest tip, because for me, that gives me the best images. But you might want to shoot really high and shoot down on them. Another one that I really liked that was different, I saw an elephant. Actually, this was in South Africa again. But we were basically on one side of a little valley, and the elephant was on the other side, and there was a lot of trees. It was basically forest, and this elephant was just in a small clearing. And I shot that picture, but at a reasonably wide angle, because what I wanted to impress there with anybody looking at it was, although we regard elephants as large animals, which they are in one sense, but in the context of the environment, I wanted to get a feeling of how small the elephant was in its own environment, because elephants have quite large ranges, so they need quite a large area to sustain themselves. So from that perspective, they're quite small. And also, when you look at something in that way, it starts to feel a little bit vulnerable. So that was what I was going for. So this is where you can just try and get something that's a little bit different. Black and white photographs are also great, and I actually put out a book a few years ago about black and white elephants in black and white, I should say, in Namibia. The thing about black and white, first of all, we don't see in black and white, so it's different. The feel of the image is different. Secondly, for me, black and white images are almost timeless, particularly if you've got no background or nothing in the background that would date it. So if you're just looking at savannah, I've got pictures of cheetahs that I put in black and white, and to me, they could have been taken last week or a couple of centuries ago. Obviously, there weren't cameras then, but if you know what I mean, there's a timeless aspect to them. Also, black and white is about textures, it's about shapes. So again, things like elephant hide really come out, and also a lot of the hairs, because elephants have quite a lot of hair around their face that sends things around their lips, obviously around their eyes, and often in colour pictures we don't see them because we see in colour, we tend to see an elephant's face. We don't look at the detail, but black and white can really push the detail out. So it's very well worth experimenting with that. In terms of composition, think about reflections. If you're near water, use those. Look at silhouettes. Look at a partial framing. Don't photograph the whole face when you're shooting a portrait. I've already mentioned that, and that can give you a very moody shot if you do that right. So you can do this with ordinary animals as well. So this is where I come to how you prepare, and that is just practice. So if you have pets, try photographing them. And try these different techniques, try different angles, try different backgrounds, all that kind of thing. If you don't have pets, look where there might be animals. So there might be farms near you or somewhere else where there's animals that you can photograph. The last resort is birds. I don't mean that in a mean way, but for the kind, well, it depends what you plan to shoot. But birds are everywhere, and they can be quite difficult to shoot if you've got a bird moving against a background. So birds are really good for just honing those skills. Photographing a relatively small subject against a background, particularly when it's moving. So I would definitely recommend doing that. Okay, so just to recap, key things really are to, first of all, be very patient, observe what's going on, be as knowledgeable as you can about behaviours, but be open to learning as well. Portraits, to me, are primarily about creating connection with a subject, but also portraits can be telling a story. And once you start diving into it, there are many different ways you can shoot portraits. So I've covered a lot of those. Think about the gear that you're using and how best to use it. And practice as much as you can with local wildlife, pets, anything that gives you a reasonable subject. So that is it for this one. Please remember, if you found this useful, please remember to like and subscribe. I do have a book you can download as a PDF, which is a brief guide to wildlife photography. So it goes into a lot of details and different things. And in the next episode, having gone through the capturing process, we're going to move away to what happens afterwards. So we're going to start looking at post-processing and some thoughts and ideas about that. So I hope you found this useful. I'll speak to you in the next episode. Bye for now. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. Now, I just want to say thank you for tuning in and joining me in the Wildlife and Adventure Photography podcast. If you have enjoyed today's episode, please give me a like, a subscribe, maybe tell your friends, and by all means leave a comment. And if there is a subject you would like me to cover in the future, please let me know, and I'll be very happy to do my best. So thanks again for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you again next podcast. Bye for now.